I will now hand it off to Jakob, who is the CEO of the Global Wind Organization, who will give us an intro on the critical standards for success in the offshore wind industry. Over to you, Jakob.
Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm quite excited to be working with you guys in GWEC, and I'm proud to present this first output of our partnership with this report on workforce training and workforce training needs in the offshore wind sector. I'll leave it to Ed Maxwell from ICG later to go into the details of the methodology of the report and how we reached all of these conclusions. But for now, I'll just like to spend a short time explaining a little bit about who we are, the GWO. So on this slide, we are a non-for-profit body founded by wind turbine manufacturers and wind owners. So our members are the largest manufacturers, 9 of the big top 10 manufacturers, and a similar number of the top operators of wind turbines, both on and offshore. Our goal is to strive for an injury-free working environment in the wind turbine industry, setting common international standards for safety training and emergency procedures. And as I say in the introduction to this report, every global industry must apply standards whenever it can, and we do so in the wind industry in many ways, and one of the ways is for basic safety training. And the first standard was released in 2012 as a response to a global demand for a more recognizable standard that could be mutually recognized amongst the big actors. And today we have more than 90,000 people with a valid GWO training certificate, and these are and many of these will complete what you can see on the screen here from our standards portfolio, the core modules for safety, first aid, working at height, manual handling, and fire awareness. And for those technicians that go to work offshore, they add the Sea Survival task-specific module to their training. So in addition, a lot of those guys are also taking basic technical courses, electrical, hydraulic, and mechanical. And for other task-specific roles, we have developed more modules. All of these modules give a benefit not just to the technicians working on site, because they can handle situations and are prepared for safety critical situations, but really for the employers in the wind industry, they get significant benefits from this. They can, with a standardized and recognized standard, training standard, they can validate their technicians training by looking it up in our wind industry database. We call it WINDA, and some of you may be familiar with it. There's even a chance that some of you guys out there actually have a WINDA profile. Every person with a GWO training will get a unique ID, and I have one myself. Of course, with this system, any employer who wishes to see and view what valid training I have can look me up in the database, and means they don't have to retrain people in those basic safety trainings. And that was the situation in the beginning when we created this standard, that we would have a lot of repetition of training of similar sort. Working at height could be delivered in several ways, and technicians were asked to retrain themselves in skills they already had. So the result is today that on average, we estimate that 5 days of training, duplicated training, is avoided per year per technician. So 5 days of more productive time over a year is roughly 2% more productivity from each of the workers in a site. And that's quite a lot, and you can put some numbers to that if you want to, in terms of euros or dollars or yuan or whatever currency you use. But for us, it's about an injury-free working environment as well. It's good that we have a hand-in-hand between economic benefit and safety benefit. What you can see on the picture is from a training center where they train sea survival. So in normal circumstances, about 80% of the training is practical, scenario-based exercises, and 20% theoretical. And those of you who have completed a course yourselves, you will know that unless you use your skills, like first aid, you tend to fade in memory. So I haven't done my first aid course for 2 years, and I certainly wouldn't feel safe or competent to do a resuscitation today. I need to refresh my skills. Of course, we're not in normal circumstances today. COVID-19, and this is the only slide I'm going to spend on COVID today, is disrupting our normal business. And we have more than 1,000 technicians every week that run out of validity of their training. Because the technicians training are usually refreshed every 2 years. So that 1,000 technicians run out of validity of training per week as we speak is a problem, and it creates a greater potential for skills fade. So we've introduced some flexibility, and we're launching a new online version of parts of the basic safety training. We actually did that yesterday. So if you have any questions about that element, I can answer that in the Q&A later, or you can go to our website to look at that. So next slide, please. So this is a map showing locations of training centers that deliver GWO training. And we have a network today of more than 350 certified training providers. Each of them have been independently certified by a third party according to our requirements, and the third party audit ensures that those 350 training centers are able to deliver training at the quality that we have set, meaning employers can trust that training that comes out of any of those training centers meets the requirements of the employers of the industry. Around 80% of the training takes place in Europe. It has originated in the old wind markets of Europe, Spain, UK, Denmark, Germany. But markets are opening up all over the world. We have, I think, 42 or 43 countries on the map right now. And that's why we have, actually that leads me to why we partnered with GWEC to produce this report. Because in new countries where training centers start looking at GWO as a possibility, something they would like to offer to the industry, what they ask us is, how many do we need to train? What's the business case in this? And we've been struggling a little bit to get some good numbers. But then it dawned on us, one way is to partner with GWEC, produce this report, and focus solely on the offshore market, because in the offshore market we can single out unique sets of requirements, which is the Sea Survival module, and we can look at what has been built out in certain historic markets, and from that, and coupled with GWEC's market numbers, create some measure of an answer to the question, how many people needs to get trained in this market as we start off. Yeah. Next slide, please. So to illustrate how rapidly we've been growing and how good an idea it is to create the standards, is really to look at what is the number of people that have been trained. We created the winter database in 2016, and the growth has been beyond what we thought. It's really been growing rapidly. Our forecast for 2020 was to grow with about 25% in 2020. So from 90,000 to 112,000 in 2020. COVID is really affecting that. I can say that we are 20% down this quarter compared to our projections, or in other words, that we are training approximately as many as we did last year, this time of year. And we have come a long way in a short time. And by working together as an association that's led by the big employers and creating a reliable system and a platform for continuous improvement, we feel that we have we're producing some good value to the industry, and our members are strongly behind this growth. We don't want to stop here. So to be really effective, we need some more input from more employers that have yet to work with GWO. We're reaching out to all of the large operators in the key markets and offering them to become members and help shape and form the output that we do. So last year, Iberdrola joined, CGN, China General Nuclear is joining. Companies of that size are joining and leading the way for the industry. And both of these companies bringing more than 6,000 directly employed technicians into each one of them into the scope for GWO training. And that's really how we can bring value to the industry, is by uniting even more companies behind the common standards. I think the benefits to them are as clear as they were to the original founders. There's no need to retrain people unnecessarily, but there is a need to make sure that you know more or less what kind of training a person has who's working on your site, whether he comes from your own company or from a sub-supplier. And having a unique standard or a common standard to work against means you can, on an offshore wind site, make sure that everyone, regardless of their daily employer, they have the same kind of competences, and you can control safety much better. And so in this report, we're trying to provide some numbers to those markets where you're starting up with the offshore wind, US, East Coast, Taiwan, all of those 6 markets that we have mentioned in this report. Looking at the numbers from some of the historically leading markets, our guess is that the future leading markets will have a similar need, and I hope that with this information that we can help each other move forward and towards achieving our mission of creating an injury-free working environment in wind. We hope that you will learn from the old markets and not repeat the mistakes of the old markets, and we would like to help in all of these respects. So with that, thank you very much, and I would like to give it to you, Joyce.
Thank you so much, Jakob. As you mentioned, the offshore industry is rapidly expanding into new and emerging markets. So now I'll ask Joyce Lee, Policy and Operations Director at GWEC, to provide more information on the global market outlook for offshore wind to 2024.
Great. Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you to Jakob. It's great to be on this webcast today. GWEC, as the Global Trade Association for Wind, is very excited about this partnership with GWO, as it supports our mission to promote wind power around the world and build a sustainable workforce for our industry. So our role in the Powering the Future report was primarily guiding the forecasting for market growth to 2024, drawing from our market intelligence dataset, which forecasts for offshore wind out to 2030. So during my part of the presentation, I will be reviewing these global growth figures and also zooming into some of the market by market commentary covered in this report. Before I look at the forecast growth, I wanted to first review the current status of the offshore market. So our starting point. And this chart here depicts the growth of both onshore and offshore wind over the last 5 years. As we can see in the progression of the light blue bars, we saw strong growth in 2019 in particular, with 6.1 gigawatts of new offshore installations around the world. Most of this was concentrated in mainland China and the UK, as well as Germany, Denmark, Belgium, and a few other markets. Of the total volume of installations last year, offshore wind comprised around 10%. And that's a ratio that we see increasing over the next decade, which reflects not only the enormous resource potential for offshore wind around the world, but also strengthening policy support, as well as increasing cost reductions of offshore technology. So overall, last year was a very strong year. We had a 19% increase in installations from the year prior. And this data plus more is available on the GWEC website, particularly in our Global Wind Report. Next slide. And now we look ahead to 2024, which captures the reference period for this report. So the global picture foresees fairly steady growth in new offshore installations, once again in the light blue bars at the top of each column. There's more than 355 gigawatts, which is set to be installed by 2024, of which nearly 51 gigawatts is going to come from offshore wind. And that will peak in the final year of the reference period when we foresee 15 gigawatts in 2024 alone. You will see that 2020 was forecast to be a record year with installations of onshore and offshore peaking at 76.1 gigawatts. We will be revising this forecast for 2020 due to the impact of COVID-19, just to head off any questions about this. We can address the impact of the virus further later on in the Q&A, but as Alyssa mentioned, we also have a very substantive COVID-19 response hub on the GWEC website, which includes information on things like commissioning deadline extensions around the world. Next slide. So here is where it gets quite interesting for the growth picture, because whereas global installations had a steady compound annual growth rate of 4% over the reference period, we are forecasting a pocket of very intense growth for these 6 emerging offshore markets covered in our report in Asia Pacific and North America. So their compound annual growth rate is almost 20% from 2020 to 2024. Altogether, that accounts for 31 gigawatts of new installations, or nearly 2/3 of the total global offshore installations. It's also worth pointing out that almost 2/3 of that 31 gigawatts is going to come from mainland China, and I'll speak about that market in particular shortly. Alyssa, if you could click so we could get the pop-out box to appear. So one last note on COVID-19. We're going to release our revised forecast in the first half of this year. We are, of course, seeing difficulties, squeezes on the supply chain, order fulfillment, and sufficient manufacturing workforce, as Jakob had touched on, especially in those large export markets, which are currently in lockdown. So for the purposes of this report, we did not revise that total 31 gigawatt forecast down for these 6 markets. The view is that these installations are going to shift to later years. And since the concentration of most of the delivered capacity is in mainland China, we've already seen a very early recovery of the local supply chain, and there's still some runway in China between now and the 2021 deadline ahead for the offshore sector. So while there's going to be undoubtedly changes to the distribution of the annual figures, we're still confident in the cumulative delivery of 31 gigawatts 5 years out. Next slide. So now, as mentioned, I'm going to look at each market in a bit more detail. China is the largest offshore wind market outside of Europe, and it became the top market in terms of new installations as of 2018, surpassing the UK in offshore. It has moved very swiftly past its initial 5 gigawatts by 2020 target as of last year, and it now nearly has 7 gigawatts of total offshore wind capacity. As you can see in the distribution in this graph, there's going to be a small rush to market in the next 2 years as offshore developers are seeking to benefit from the current feed-in tariff of 0.85 renminbi per kilowatt hour for grid-connected projects by the end of 2021. Although at least 40 gigawatts of offshore projects have been approved by national and provincial authorities, we expect 7.5 gigawatts to be commissioned by this subsidy deadline. And that's largely due to bottlenecks in the supply chain, particularly in installation vessels. Then from 2022, the Ministry of Finance has signaled intention to lift subsidies from offshore wind entirely, which would push the industry to compete in wholesale markets at price levels largely set by coal-fired generation. Some key policy drivers in the mainland Chinese market are the ambitious long-term targets that have been set by provincial authorities, particularly Guangdong with 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, followed by Jiangsu with 15 gigawatts, Zhejiang with 6.5 gigawatts, and Fujian province with 5 gigawatts. Large state-owned developers like China Three Gorges, CGN, which Yaka mentioned, Longyuan, and China Resources or Huaneng have prioritized offshore wind and are dominating the market currently, but we are seeing more foreign players enter the offshore sector through partnerships, such as EDF from France, as well as Equinor from Norway. As well, the local offshore wind supply chain is likely to mature within this reference period. There's value brought by larger turbines, which are being manufactured domestically under development currently, and we're also going to see further cost reductions realized through domestic economies of scale. Next slide. So on North America, the report focuses mostly on the US as the only emerging offshore market in North America with growth during this forecast period. Right now, the US has one 30 megawatt offshore project at Block Island, which is off of Rhode Island, but there's more than 26 gigawatts of federal lease areas which have been issued to date. Of these, we forecast around 5.7 gigawatts to come online by 2024. And you can see very clearly here that growth is concentrated in the latter years, mainly in the states of New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, as well as Maine. We've recently seen states such as New York and New Jersey set ambitious procurement targets to 2035. Virginia was the latest. Last month, they passed a bill for 5.2 gigawatts of offshore by 2034. In 2020, you can see that we expect the two turbine 12 megawatt pilot project off of Virginia to come online, and that will pave the way for the adjacent Dominion Energy wind farm, which is worth noting because it's 2.6 gigawatts in volume. It will be the largest offshore wind project developed in the US, with the first phase coming online in 2024. Until then, the industry is going to be observing the progress of the Vineyard Wind 1 project, which is 800 megawatts off of Massachusetts, where we've seen that construction has been delayed recently due to pending environmental impact statement. So the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, has pushed its decision on this matter to December of this year, meaning this project, which is the first of this size to be developed in the US offshore sector, might no longer come online by 2022. But this is going to be an important litmus test for the permitting process of larger offshore projects in the US, because we want to avoid the prolonged legal disputes which have previously hindered projects. Next slide. So I'm going to try to wrap up. I'm not going to go into detail in each market here, but just highlighting that we're seeing strong growth across several Asia Pacific markets, clearly led by Taiwan in the lighter blue on the graph, with 3.6 gigawatts forecast to be installed. So it's on track to become the second largest offshore market in the region after China. And then that's followed by 1.1 gigawatts in Vietnam, 860 megawatts in Japan, and just more than 500 megawatts in South Korea. So I think if there are any questions on specific markets, we can get to that in the Q&A. But just to sum up this portion, overall, we are seeing that 31 gigawatts of offshore capacity still being delivered despite the current difficulties for these 6 target markets by 2024. And as Jakob mentioned, our report finds that nearly 80,000 skilled workers are going to be needed to deliver the construction and installation components of these projects. So I'm going to hand it now to Ed to walk us through how we arrived at those figures and a few more key insights from the report.
Thanks so much, Joyce. And as you mentioned, if you have any questions about the particular markets or from the first 2 presentations, please do submit your questions in the Q&A. I'll now hand it over to Ed from the Renewables Consulting Group, who will give us a bit more detailed insights about the findings of the report.
Thank you, Alyssa, and good morning to everyone listening and watching this morning. Apologies you can't see me on the video today. As Alyssa said, I'm Ed Maxwell, Senior Associate at the Renewables Consulting Group in the UK. We were really pleased to work with GWO and GWEC on this report. Our role was really to undertake the data analysis that you'll see presented in chapters 2 and 3 of the report that we're launching today. So I'm going to use the next 10 minutes or so to provide a brief summary on the approach that we took to analysis and some of the key findings. There's of course a lot more detail and insight in the report. This is just a summary of some of the key findings and takeaways. So our analysis was essentially split into 2 main parts. The first was to summarise the sea survival training data that has been accumulated in the WINDA database since its launch in 2016. And the second, which I'll go on to talk about shortly, was to use that training data to estimate the number of trained personnel that has been required to install each megawatt of offshore wind in Europe, and then apply this to the emerging markets that Joyce has just described. So the first part was a relatively straightforward numeric analysis of the data. I think it's important to note at this point that the report looks only at offshore wind, and therefore uses data on sea survival and sea survival refresher as a measure for the number of personnel trained to work offshore, and Jakob described that in a bit more detail earlier on. So when I talk about training in my comments, I am just referring to the sea survival modules. So the map that is on your screens now shows the number of sea survival courses delivered in each European country where there are GWO training centres. This covers the 2017 to 19 period. These are the 3 full years for which we have a complete set of data from WINDA. By some margin, the highest number of sea survival courses were completed in the UK. Don't think that's a major surprise with the size of the market there. And of course, we also see large numbers of training courses delivered in Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands in particular. I think it's quite interesting to note that there was a reasonable number of courses delivered in Poland and the Baltic states, where of course we've not yet got any projects at construction or O&M stage. And I think this in some ways illustrates the integrated cross-border nature of the industry in Europe, how we can train in one country and then work fairly easily on projects in another country. And I think that's been a huge benefit to the European industry. Next slide, please. So this table shows that same training data, but it's alongside the capacity installed or under construction at the end of 2019, which we use as a measure of the overall market size in each country. And we can see a broad correlation between the 2 sets of data. The UK and Germany appear perhaps not to train quite enough personnel for the relative size of their industries. And it could be argued that they maybe rely on expertise from other countries and personnel trained in other countries to support their industries. And conversely, you know, as I mentioned before, perhaps Poland and the Baltic states are maybe exporters of personnel to projects elsewhere in Europe. Over time, training completions have in general increased year on year, and Jakob described that in his remarks as well. There's more than a 50% increase in training across the study period. There was a notable slowing of that increase between 2018 and 19, which perhaps indicates there was some stabilisation of the workforce, or that we'd reached a critical mass necessary to support all the projects under construction simultaneously. It's also important to note, of course, the 2-year validity of the training course. So while there was a glut of training in 2018, that won't need to be refreshed until this year. And COVID aside, we may see quite significant numbers in 2020 if we can get back to the point where training can pick up again. There was a few other important points that emerged from our analysis, and I don't have slides for these, but there are many more data tables and graphs in the report. But there is an interesting annual cycle where training peaks in the first quarter, where offshore activity is likely to be at a minimum due to weather restrictions. And then it decreases in subsequent quarters as the offshore construction activity picks up. We're also able to see that a much larger proportion of personnel who already held a valid sea survival certificate and were part of the workforce at the start of 2017 remained in the workforce at the end of 2019 than for those new entrants who completed the training for the first time in 2017. So that really suggests to us that there's a reasonably stable sort of longer term core workforce in the industry, but also quite significant turnover of the newer entrants to the industry. Perhaps those people that work on a single project and then don't refresh their training when it expires. So two quite different groups of personnel that we're seeing in the data. Next slide, please. I think that slide there just summarises the comments that I just made on the changes that we saw over time. And the next slide, please, Alyssa. Thank you. I just want to touch briefly on the training providers. As the chart shows, the provider delivering the most courses over the study period was Rely on NewTech, which has a presence in the 5 largest European offshore wind markets. Together, the top 10 providers that are in this chart here accounted for just over 1/3 of the training modules that were delivered. The others category actually consists of a further 58 smaller training providers. So we've currently got 68 providers across Europe offering the Sea Survival course. So quite a spread, quite a large body of training providers. The number of training centres in each country also roughly correlates to the size of the offshore market. Again, we see Poland and the Baltic as exceptions to this rule, and the UK arguably has more than its share of training providers, but we have to consider the dispersed geography of the offshore wind projects in the UK, which might partly explain that. Now, while of course all this is a very useful analysis of the spread and reach of sea survival training as an industry standard, the underlying intent of this report was to help forecast the number of trained personnel that may be required to deliver the projected pipelines that Joyce has already described in the major emerging markets. And we can try and use the data from Europe to come up with this estimate. Next slide, please. So due to the 2-year validity of the Sea Survival course, as it's been mentioned previously, simply counting the number of courses completed does not really provide an accurate measure of how many people are trained to work offshore at a given point in time. And since we only have complete data for those 3 years, it's only really possible to accurately estimate the size of the workforce for the 2019 calendar year. And we did this by counting the number of live winder IDs with a valid Sea Survival training record at the end of each month in 2019. Now, there are of course caveats to this, and I'm sure some of you are already thinking what some of those might be, and they are set out and addressed in some detail in table 9 of the report. So I would suggest sort of taking a look at that, because it does address where there are certain limitations and assumptions to the figure that we've come up with. And as a couple of examples, our calculation has to assume that the entire offshore workforce is trained to GWO standards. Of course, there are other training courses out there, so it may be a bit of an underestimate in that regard. And of course, it doesn't account for the different training approaches that are taken by different developers and contractors when deciding who is required to complete the training. And these and other limitations are all areas for further research, but we do believe that Sea Survival completions is a useful and valid indicator to estimate the workforce size. And it's an estimate that we can refine as we accumulate more data over the coming years. And our calculations show that at the end of 2019, the European workforce had grown to just over 25,000 trained personnel, and that's the offshore workforce. We then removed just over 2,000 people who we estimated were involved with O&M activities on operational sites. And we based this on ratios of 1 technician per 3 turbines and 3 balance of plant technicians per project. Quite ballpark figures, but used as an average across the whole European fleet. So this left a construction workforce of just over 23,000 people. And dividing this by the capacity that was added in 2019 and adjusting the data to reflect that construction phases are typically multi-year, we derived the headline figure of approximately 2.5 persons per megawatt required to install a given offshore wind project. Now, this figure is likely to include those involved in foundation and cable installation, as well as turbine erection and commissioning. And on some projects, it will also include vessel crews and even those conducting pre-construction surveys. It will also likely capture client reps, HSE personnel, and others. So we're not looking purely at turbine technicians, we're looking at the whole workforce. How many people do we need to get a project from start to finish? And we can then apply this estimate to the forecasted installations in the emerging markets to derive estimated workforce requirements to deliver that growth. And we can conclude that to deliver the 31 gigawatts to 2024, almost 78,000 people will be required. Sorry, just over 77,000 people will be required. Now, these people will not all be needed immediately, and some of the figure will obviously reflect that there will be the turnover of staff that we have seen in Europe, and we assume that this will be replicated elsewhere. And of course, all the assumptions that fed into the person per megawatt figure will of course follow through into the estimates that we've made for the emerging markets. We've not adjusted the figures for specific local conditions, but we do note in the report where there might be some local factors that could impact on the workforce estimate. And we should also note this figure only covers installation. Even more people will be trained or will need to be trained for operations and maintenance phases. And I think that's really the headline from this study. This is the key point. 78,000 people in less than 5 years. It's a huge opportunity, particularly for GWO and its training providers. And I think that one line says it all, really. And they were really the main comments and commentary that I wanted to make for you today. Obviously, I suspect there might be some questions on the approach that we've taken and some of the specific data that we've presented today. Of course, there's the Q&A opportunity to follow shortly. But for now, thank you for listening, and I will hand you back to Alyssa.
Thank you so much, Ed. And now we'll go into the Q&A session here. All of our panelists who have presented today are available for the Q&A. We also have 2 other panelists on the line to answer your questions. Alistair Dutton, who is the chair of GWEC's Global Offshore Wind Task Force, and Feng Zhao, who is GWEC's strategy director. So we have a question here from, I had someone lined up, but it looks like he's gone. Oh no, there he is. From Paul, who's on the line, who has a question, I believe, more for Jakob. Paul, can you ask your question and say your name and where you're from?
Yes, thank you. Paul Moore. I'm Executive Director of Strategic Planning for the U.S. market for Midland Communications out of Atlanta, Georgia, USA. My question is, with the expected growth in the U.S. market, are there training capacity plans inland to the U.S., or obviously we're looking forward to training as it becomes available to us post COVID-19 in the European market for some of our immediate needs, but is there anything planned for U.S. capacity?
Yes. So opening a training center or getting a training center certified to GWO is always a decision, and thank you for your question, Paul. It's always a decision by the training provider themselves if they would like to offer this. We have currently 12 training centers in the US, mostly catering to the onshore market. So we've been, in the past couple of years, working with training centers up and down the coast, East Coast, to give them some visibility into what's going on in the offshore wind business in the US and what will be the needs of the future. And this report is really partly to answer some of their questions. And we do have in Massachusetts, Mass Maritime is almost ready to get certified and will deliver sea survival training. And we have an additional 5 or 6 other training centers up and down the coast that are looking into delivering this training in the coming years, because they can see that there is a pipeline of technicians that needs to be trained, and they would like to be part of this. And some of these are from the unions, who also have a long tradition of training their personnel and iron workers and steel workers and unions. They will be part of of the workforce needed to erect turbines in US waters. So yes, we do have a lot of work going on there. In fact, this report was intended to be simultaneously released in Taiwan at the Taiwan offshore wind fair and at the IPF in Baltimore at the same time to cater to those two markets.
Great, thank you.
If I could just add, Paul, we are holding a special US-focused edition of this webcast on the 30th of April. So we'll be sharing details on timing later on in the presentation, but I would encourage you to attend that edition as well. We'll be having Business Network of Offshore Wind on the line, and hopefully we can.
Can I make just one more comment here, just on this to you, Paul? Is being a global standard, sometimes words mean different things in the English language, whether you come from the US or you come from the UK or from another English-speaking country. And we have been spending the last year going through all of the training standards of the BST and several of the others, combing through language, making sure that that language is compatible with the language of the regulators in the US and compatible with the regulators of the UK and of Australia and of China and so forth. So I'm confident that training providers and employers in the US will also be ready to embrace this because we have made sure that this language is in line with what the expectations would be from BOEM and from OSHA and so forth, Coast Guard, what have you.
Terrific, thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul, for your question. We now have another question here from Charlie. Charlie, if you can just say where you're from and ask your question, please.
Good morning. Hopefully you can all hear me all fine. My name is Charlie Guthrie. I'm talking from Survivex and AIS Training, a training provider here in the UK. We've heard from GWO in the Q1 report and in this report about the strategy to grow the number of providers. My question, possibly to Jacob, is if there is a strategy to limit the providers, particularly in some of these new markets, is there a plan to control those in line with the forecasted growth in capacity, thus preventing, a gold rush of providers into China, the US, a little bit like Ed mentioned here in the UK, that the number of providers is almost outstripping the number of personnel in the industry?
The short answer is no. There's no plans on our part to interfere with the marketplace. So what our plans is to deliver as much information as we can to the marketplace, and we trust that the actors in the market can make decisions on your own. It's not our place to interfere and control how many providers are in each of the markets. What we will do, though, which may be limiting the number of training centers that we have in our portfolio, in our system, is we're setting in quality controls in a much better, let's say, in a stricter way than we have in the past. So we're looking into more documentation, more quality assurance on the part of the training centers. We need more reporting, incident reporting, and so forth from training centers, and some of those demands will, for us, ensure that we know that the quality is the correct quality, and will give us an even higher degree of comfort that we have the right quality, and that should have the effect that we will have the serious training providers left. And another remark on to your question, Charlie, and thank you for that question. It's quite, when we look into the various markets, some markets like the UK has a lot of smaller training centers and then a few big ones. whereas in other markets, it's almost dominated by big training centers. And still yet other markets, part of this basic safety training is taken care of by vocational training centers like schools. So part of the public service. So it's very different from market to market, what we see. I think we have to celebrate that we are an earth with many different kinds of countries, and they have different kinds of structures, and we have to accommodate all of that. But again, the short answer to your question is no, we're not interfering with the market. It's competition.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Charlie, for your question. We now have another question coming from Anamika. So Anamika, if you would like to introduce yourself and ask your question, please.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, this is Anamika. I'm speaking from Mumbai, India. I work with MERS Training India. Basically, my question was for Jakob. Do you see India as an emerging offshore wind market? Because right now we do have only the onshore market going on in India. So do you see a possible offshore wind market in the future?
I think the question, I will answer the question about, do I see GWO have a future in India? Yes, I do certainly see GWO, and we have identified India as one of our pioneer markets where we do not have nearly sufficient training centers or training outlets to cover the needs. And as you know, Anamika, and thank you for your question, you have, I think you have 4 or 5 GWO training centers in all of India. It is a huge market and a huge onshore market as well, with thousands and thousands of technicians working. So there is a great need. And some of the things that we will do in India, we're looking for a pioneer partner to work with there that can help us, perhaps that can help us spread the word. And we're also looking to give competences to local auditors that can work on our behalf to audit and certify training centers out there. And so we will be looking to increase your competition, if you will, in your market. Whether India is an offshore market, that's really not my place to say. I think that's for colleagues at GWEC who are the market experts.
Yeah, thanks, Jakob. I was just going to say, I think I'll bring in my Alistair Dutton, who is the chair of our Global Offshore Wind Task Force, who can give a bit of information on the market outlook for India. And perhaps, Alistair, if you just want to briefly kind of mention other kind of key markets to watch for the offshore wind industry, that would be super.
Okay, thank you very much for your question, Anamika. So India, yes, it has offshore wind potential, and there is work going on at the moment. The government is seeking 30 gigawatts by 2030, which will be going some. And there is research work going on in 2 regions. One is off Gujarat to the northwest of the country. And then there's an even more impressive wind resource down off Tamil Nadu. So there's wind measurement campaigns, bathymetry surveys, geophysical surveys, all being done by NIVE, and the data is being collated. The difficulty at the moment is actually how to launch the market, and we're working with the Indian government we think there is a good way forward, but at the moment they're looking to start with a 1 gigawatt project, and so far no country has started with a 1 gigawatt project. They've started with demonstration projects, but this is work in hand. So yes, watch this space. In terms of other markets, there are many now starting to bubble up. And in fact, just off India, you've got Sri Lanka, which the government there would like offshore wind. South Korea has been mentioned. Vietnam, I was on 2 calls yesterday with the Vietnamese government, and they particularly getting excited by offshore wind. And then there's potential for these markets to grow this decade and even more next decade as prices continue to come down and countries understand the wider benefits of offshore wind. It's not just power, it's jobs, it's inward investment, all the things that governments really like. I'll stop there. I could go on a lot longer.
Thank you so much. You have clarified my question. Thank you so much, Jakob. Thank you so much. Yeah.
If I may, for Namika. I think historically in Europe, quite a few of the people who go to work on an offshore wind farm were previously technicians working onshore. So you bring your skills from working in a wind turbine onshore, and then you're given the additional courses and qualifications to work offshore. So Sea Survival is just one module you need to work in a wind turbine offshore. You do need to have your electrician's degree or mechanics degree, and then you have all of the other safety courses that I mentioned earlier on in the slides. So there is a case for training GWO in India that's much bigger than offshore, and then limited to this to the focus of this call.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, this is only one input that I want to give from my side. I guess in India, GWO has not yet been made compulsory.
True.
Yeah. So that is one reason why the trainings are happening. The GWO standards are being followed much less in India because I mean, they do not take it as a compulsory mandatory course.
Yeah.
Could I just add a point? I don't know if there are many more questions, Alyssa. Sorry, you're on mute at the moment. So one of the really key things to get over is that health and safety for offshore is absolutely critical. Early on in the markets in the UK and in Germany, I'm sorry to say some people died. Offshore, a good performing project, i.e. it runs on time, on budget, nearly always will have a good health and safety record as well. So it's actually really good for business, and training for technicians and everybody who's working on an offshore wind farm is super important. So it's not a cost, it's actually a benefit. And that's why we're so keen to work with GWO.
Thanks, Alistair, and I indeed was on mute. So just before we finish off, I just wanted to bring in our strategy director, Feng Zhao here, just to give a kind of brief update on how COVID-19 is impacting the offshore industry in terms of supply chain and forecast, particularly in China, and how they're recovering. So Feng, if you just want to give kind of a brief update on that to finish us off.
Thank you, Alicia. As Joe mentioned earlier in this webinar, there's one slide to indicate, at least in the target market in this report, we don't see a tremendous challenging in terms of the impact from COVID-19 compared with onshore. There are a couple of reasons. First of all, looking at the market, for 2020, the majority of the installation on slide 14, you can just bring it back. So you can see China will have more than 90% of the total installation for 2020. You know, we all know the pandemic or the virus crisis started in China from the end of January. So luckily, China gets the virus under control within 3 months. And based on the input from the local turbine OEM Goldwyn division, a week ago, we had a webcast where we address the challenge in terms of COVID-19. So the message is clear. Offshore is less impact in terms of the workforce or the quarantine requirements and the disruption of the supply chain. because the market, especially the turbine OEM developer, they have been ready and well prepared for this installation rush. So also the workforce, they have to work isolate offshore anyway. So that's a different situation compared with onshore, where the logistic and also the workforce are not allowed to go to the project site to do the work. So right now in China, the largest market, globally speaking, and also in our target groups, that's the largest market. So in looking at the recovering of the local supply chain based on the information from the three speakers we invited from China last week, 99% of the project work or the production in terms of the supply chain almost back to on track. So that's a good sign. And for the rest of the market, for European market, 2020 and 2021, it's rather a slow year. If we're looking at how many projects will be built in the two largest markets, the UK and Germany. For emerging market covered in this report, we have Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, USA. Volume is relatively small. Only 2 turbines expect to be built in the US. In Vietnam, we have the intertidal project to be built. So it's not really offshore, looking at the distance or the water depths. Taiwan, we only have 1 project to be built this year. Japan, we don't see any project to be built this year. South Korea, we only have 1 project, 6 MW, expect to be grid connected. So again, looking at the pipeline for 2020, I think the general picture is relatively better in terms of the impact compared with onshore. So hopefully the situation will be different start from 2021. I think that's the whole summary. Thank you, Alicia.
Thanks so much, Feng, for that. And as you mentioned, you can find more info on the wind industry and COVID-19 response hub on the GWEC website. So I'll wrap up the webcast here. Would encourage you all, if you haven't already, to download the report. As Joyce mentioned earlier, we'll be also hosting a US edition of this webcast on the 30th of April, and going into a bit more details on the workforce training needs to meet the US offshore wind goals. And then we'll be doing another focus on APAC later in May. So I would encourage you guys all to join those as well, and download the report. Thank you for all of our panelists and for all of the attendees for joining us today for this virtual launch. If you have any further questions, please feel free to send an email to info@gwec.net and we'd be happy to answer. With that being said, have a wonderful afternoon or evening wherever you are.